We're not going to be talking about covenantal ethics today, though I will say, and just to kind of say one more thing about that. If you read, the Pew population study on the Jewish community, one of the really big concerns moving forward in the future is the whole idea of Jewish peoplehood, and what younger people actually think about that, in the sense that the youngest generation doesn't really, they're much more focused on universal values, and less focused, or not focused at all, on covenantal values. And then that's a big concern, and it affects how they feel about Jewish peoplehood. It certainly affects how they feel about Israel. So it's a very topical subject. But today we are going to talk about environmental ethics. It probably, I would hope, not surprise anybody that Judaism has quite a bit to say about our responsibility towards the earth. And so, we're going to begin at the beginning, which is with the creation of the world. So the first thing that we're going to look at is from chapter 1 of the book of Genesis. And we'd already talked about this, that the idea that human beings are created in the image of God. When we talked about universal ethics, that was the basis of the idea that we are in some ways responsible for all human beings, or the way we treat all human beings, and a certain equality. And then the Torah goes on to say, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on earth. So the word in Hebrew is kivshuha, which literally means to rule over, right? That human beings are, in this case, there is a hierarchy, and that we rule over all of the animals. We're going to look in just a moment, though. This is from Genesis chapter 1. This is the story where we're told that both men and women are created in the image of God. This is often referred to as creation 1, the creation 1 story. There is a second creation story in the Torah, and that's the story that you're probably all very familiar with, the story that Eve was taken from Adam's rib. So in story 1, human beings are created in the image of God, and they are placed on the earth to rule over all of the animals. But now let's look at creation story 2. So this is after God has created human beings. And in verse 15, the Lord God took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to till it and tend it. To till it and tend it. So what's the difference? You can unmute yourself if you want to participate. What is the difference in attitude or outlook in the first creation story versus the second creation story? What is the different, what is a human being's role on this earth regarding the earth or the other animals? Marcia?
There's still a hierarchy, but it's a caring for. It's not it's not a diminishing of. In a way, it's exalting the earth because it is to be cared for.
Okay. Anybody else? Norm?
Norm's on?
Norm, you're muted.
It's a ruler versus a caretaker.
Okay, so how does that change our attitude? When we think about environmental...
Norm is on, Bob Sirota, Claudia Linda.
Henry, you're not muted. Henry, can you mute? Henry, can you mute yourself? So how does that change? How might that change our attitude towards the earth if in one story we're told that we rule over it, and the other story we're told that we till it and tend it?
You have responsibility for taking care, well, they're both taken care of in a sense, but in one, you're responsible for all of the animals, you're responsible for making sure they have everything, and the other, it's just you're tending to the land itself. A caretaker. Ruler versus caretaker, it's a big difference.
Tell me what, if somebody tell me what's the practical difference? I mean, this actually, this question, this balance is a question that is so relevant, right, to the world that we live in. Elise?
So I think that the difference is really that if you have dominion of it, you can use it for your own purposes, as opposed to if you are a caretaker of it, you have to consider that others may need those resources as well. I think being a ruler is not, you could have a benevolent ruler. So it's not necessarily inconsistent. But I think if you are going to rule and attend, you have to take into account the interests of people other than the ruler themselves.
Good. Julie?
Well, I think you have responsibility for the continuity of whatever it is you're taking care of. So you don't just say, I'm going to shoot every single bird because they taste good in my vicinity. You have to think, well, if we shoot all the birds, then there's not going to be birds for the next generation. So as opposed to dominion, it's more of a stewardship for the future.
Judy, did I see your hand up? Judy?
Yeah, I was kind of following on what everyone said really is, you know, when you're tilling and tending the earth, you're nurturing it, something's going to grow from it, and there's a benefit to you doing it. Whereas if you're ruling over something, if you're not a benevolent ruler, you don't really care about nurturing. You're just kind of trying to control something. And here you're tilling and tending, and you're maybe trying to encourage something good to come from it.
So good. So the question is, I mean, if you think about just the issue of natural resources. Now, our ancestors, I don't know, maybe there was a way to use up a few things like in your neighborhood, right? But our ancestors really weren't faced with the kind of questions that we're faced with, which is, can you just keep using them until they're used up? You know, are the natural resources, you know, are trees just there to be cut down to build buildings with? Especially, you know, in ancient times when there was, you know, more of an abundance, there wasn't a sense that you could use everything up. But the idea is, what are these natural resources? Are they there for human beings to just use in any way they want because you rule over everything? Or is there a responsibility that human beings have to make sure that you don't abuse the earth for your own purposes? And so, yes, of course, you could have a benevolent ruler, but these two values sort of are juxtaposed one to the other. And so you could say, so which one is it for Judaism, right? Which one is it? You've got one that says it's all yours, right? It's all yours. You're the ruler. Do what you want with it. Use it up, take it, use it for your purposes. Or is it, you know, you have to be a conservationist and to protect it and to think about it and to think about how you use it. And of course, the lovely thing about Judaism is the answer is both, right? Both. It's both at the same time, which actually, while that may sound like, oh, great, that's, you know, how does that help us? But unless anybody on this call has decided that they're only going to ride a bicycle from now on and never drive a car that uses fossil fuel, you know, we all have to make, you know, that decision about what is the balance. And in some ways, remember in the olden days when this used to be sort of the, you know, that Republicans, were thought about things like business and jobs, as opposed to some of the other crazy things they think now. And so, they would make the argument that environmental protection, can't be a priority if it's going to take jobs away from people. And other people felt that even though it might take jobs away, you had to protect the earth. And it was a policy, dispute. But this is a real political question, right? It's a real political question between how you balance using the resources versus preserving the resources. And for the first time, probably in human history, we live in a time where the damage that we've done is so great that we are really worried about, for some of us are really worried about the point of no return. And so, interestingly enough, Judaism actually addresses this in a source that's 2,000 years old, right? That's 2,000 years old. It's a commentary. The book of Ecclesiastes is a book of the Bible. You may be familiar with its most, famous phrase, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. But there is a midrashic commentary, a homiletic commentary on the book of Ecclesiastes. And this is probably, when we look at Judaism and environmental ethics, one of probably the most famous sources that we would use. So let me just put it on the screen. So I'm sorry, I'm still, we are stumped at the synagogue as to why I can't play with my screen and make the text bigger or smaller. And everybody seems to be stumped about this. So I apologize again that I can't leave this on the screen. But we're going to look at Ecclesiastes Rabbah. So this is fantasizing, right, or making a homiletic point about what happens when God creates the world. So whether it's story one or whether it's story two, the idea is that God is God is like the tour guide. God is showing Adam around this Garden of Eden, this beautiful garden that he created and put human beings in. And God says to Adam, see the works of God, for who can repair that which he has perverted? When God created the first human being, God took him around to see all the trees of the Garden of Eden and said to him, see my creations, how beautiful and praiseworthy they are. And all that I have created for you. Be careful not to ruin or destroy my world, for if you ruin it, no one will repair it after you. Right? So it's all for you, right? The world was created for human beings to use. The world was created for you to enjoy it, to participate in it. But remember, if you destroy it, that's it. God is just finished. In these stories that it's commenting on, God has just done this unbelievable, miracle. Let there be light and there's light. Let there be water and there's water. And God does these great miracles in creating the world. And God says in this story, it's a one-time deal, guys. It's a one-time deal. I'm not going to come back and clean up. I'm not going to come back and clean up your mess. So as I said, this source is about 2,000 years old. So, what do you think? Flo? Flo, you're muted. I'm going to let Rosette.
Somehow I've always, excuse me.
Go ahead.
Okay, somehow I've always been thinking, when did it come about that we said that we need to let the land sit every 7 years? When did that come about? Because that, to me, that fits right in to this question.
So that's from the Torah. Interestingly enough, Hartman did not choose any of those sources as part of this unit. But in the Torah, we are told that every 7 years, so earlier than Ecclesiastes Rabbah, right? So there are sources from the Torah that talk about our stance. So this was an excellent question, that talks about our stance towards the world. And so one of them is that every 7 years, you have to let the land lay fallow. You're not allowed to till it or to tend it. And you are allowed to pick anything that grows naturally. So that is, the understanding of that is that, as we know, that you can over farm land, right? You can over farm land and it will stop producing, and even the land, and of course, 7 years, it's a Shabbat, right? That every 7 years, the land rests. Now, the question is that we don't really know is, was this ever enacted? The Torah has a lot of utopian aspirational values. Would it have actually ever really been possible for nobody to farm their land, at the same time in a whole year? Like, what would people have actually eaten? Today in Israel, interestingly enough, this is still, and it's only for the land of Israel. You don't have to do it anywhere else. It's only, if when you lived in Poland, you didn't have to let your land lay fallow. It's only about your relationship to the land of Israel. And today it's actually practiced amongst the Orthodox kibbutzim, and Orthodox, really traditional Jews will only buy, and it only applies to Jews. So Arab farmers can till their land in the 7th year. But people that observe this in Israel, it is actually the 7th year right now as we speak. This is the sabbatical year for the land in Israel. And so traditional Jews would only buy produce from Arab farmers during this year. So interestingly enough, it is actually topical. There are other laws in the Torah that go along with this, like having to leave the corners of your field for poor people to come in and to glean. And one of the themes that sort of runs through these verses in the Torah is you don't actually own the land, which, while it's not specifically necessarily, all of these laws are not specific necessarily to the environment, but this idea of ownership, right? That what is it that we actually own? What is our stance towards our things? In the Torah, there are laws like if your animal is working in a field, you can't muzzle it. You have to let it eat. If somebody's walking by your field, they can, pick a piece of fruit off of your tree. It's the constant reminder that you don't actually own the land. God owns the land. And so in a way that does have sort of an environmental stance, this idea that, it's mine, I can do with it however I want, is not actually really such a Jewish value, even though Creation 1 story would seem to think that you get to rule over it, meaning it's yours, you can do whatever you want. Other laws in the Torah seem to mitigate that stance. It's probably the only source that just says, you rule over it, which would lead you to think, it's mine. All of the other verses in the Torah and other rabbinic literature really softens that stance and really comes out a little bit more on the tilling and tending it. Deanna?
Yeah, I do have a question about this. So we just recently went on, I knew about the sabbatical year, the year I was in Israel as a teen. We weren't allowed to plant trees with JNF because it was
Right.
that year, which was, of course, disappointing. And it's interesting that the Arabs can do it, because it's really interesting to me, actually. The more you talk, the more interested that the Arabs can plant on that exact same land, that the Poles can plant, the Polish Jews can plant, even though they're Jewish, we can do it. That's really intriguing to me. And it feels, I'll just say, inconsistent. That why is that the case? And then part 2 of the question is, we just went on vacation. One of the things we did, because everything had to be outside, was we went foraging. So foraging would still be permissible. It was amazing, the food that we found. And, so foraging is still permissible even in
Foraging is permissible. And people had to eat. So the question is, why does this just apply to Jews? Because it's not just simply be easy to say it's about the environment. Like people say, you know, oh, keeping kosher was about health. The Torah is not a medical manual. So if it doesn't apply, if you're a Jew and you're living outside the land of Israel, and if it doesn't apply, if you are an Arab farmer living in the land of Israel, that comes to teach us that this isn't about necessarily just about, oh, they discovered that, you know, it wasn't good to keep, you know, planting and tilling and all of this, and it's bad for the land, and therefore, you know, you need, because then they could have said, make sure you rotate your crops, you know, like don't forget, rotate your crops. This is really about the Jewish people's relationship to the land of Israel.
Right,
Right. That this is a gift from God. You know, you know, one of the things that I'm really struggling with is the new and constantly evolving anti-Zionist stance coming from the left. And this is not really a new charge, but it's absolutely now adopted by the left. And some of the stuff that Dan hears at DePaul is really hard to take. But the new line is that the Jewish people are not indigenous to the land of Israel. We are European colonizers. Now, that's interesting on a lot of fronts. One, people that would have been the most surprised that we were European colonizers were the Europeans, because in most of the countries of Europe, Jews weren't even allowed to be citizens. I mean, one of the things that drives me insane when people say to me, oh, you know, Jewish people say, oh yeah, my grandparents were Polish. It's like, your grandparents weren't Polish. Like, they were not citizens. They were not Polish. They were not Russian. They were Jews. So that's, you know, they weren't European. So that's, you know, point one. And point two, it would be very shocking to all of the Jews, which is the majority of the population in Israel, that are Mizrahi, that came from Arab countries, to find out that they were European colonizers, since they didn't live in Europe. And, you know, so this whole thing is so ahistorical. But the other thing is, it's very hard to like know these Jewish sources and know how ancient they are, and know the constant refrain in the Torah, in the Siddur, in the Haggadah, in the Machzor, throughout all of our history for thousands of years, that we have a special relationship with this land. And so how we treat this land that is a gift from God is different than how we have to treat you know, other places that we live. So it's not just a pragmatic farming technique. It's far more than that, which isn't to say that if you were a smart farmer in Poland, you might rotate your crops or let certain fields lay fallow at certain points, you know, in the cycle. It doesn't mean you can't adopt good environmental practice, or should
No, I am interested now.
adopt good environmental practice to the land where you're living. It means that the requirement for how you relate to this land is different. Neil or Adrian, I see your hand is raised.
Rabbi, when you were talking about a Polish Jew and the different, how we sometimes say, are we a Jewish American or an American Jew? Could you comment on that in terms of if someone, because non-Jews sometimes, the first thing a non-Jew will ask, well, what's your background? And do we just say we're Jewish and stop right there? Or do we say, well, I'm Jewish, but my ancestors came from Russia?
Well, okay. So, you know, I think everybody answers this question a little bit different. I've decided many years ago, when you have to take a survey for what race you are, I just say other. Because I think saying white doesn't really say anything about really who I am. But I can tell you, my kids feel very comfortable and I'll check white and feel like, you know, whatever. So I feel like how you take a stance to your Jewish identity. So I think you could say I'm Jewish, because I think that's a tribal identity. You could certainly say I'm an American Jew or I'm Jewish American. But what I wouldn't say, and you could say my ancestors came from Poland, but what I wouldn't say is my ancestors were Polish, my ancestors were Russian. That's just ahistorical. They weren't citizens. They didn't consider themselves Russian or Polish. And certainly the Poles and the Russians did not consider them Russian or Polish. So it's ahistorical to say that. But how you describe yourself and your identity, I think, I think it's individual. I think it's still somewhat individual. My grandparents hated that question. And they would say, I'm American, because they felt that it was a microaggression, though they wouldn't have used that phrase, that it was a microaggression to ask that question. And since I'm going to give you one last thing, and then we're going back to the environment.
You know what, first of all, in Russia, we were citizens. So
Right.
that's.
Well, you were citizens. You were a citizen. I'm talking about our grandparents and our great.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, yes, my grandparents were citizens.
Okay.
Anyway, doesn't matter. But when I'm asked this question, I learned that basically people want to know where you came from, not your religious status, which they consider that Jews are religion, to be Jewish. So I'm always now saying that I hated to say I'm Russian. I never said I'm Russian. But I was born in Russia. Okay. And then if they continue to ask other questions, then and I can say, and I became American, and such time. So, you can always find a way. But people really interested where you're born, not so much what is your other identity.
Right. So I know I keep bringing us back to this because this is just like my obsession that I can't, but this is like, because Rosette, let's go back to the environment for a minute. So, but this is just, because Dan is on the college campus, this is just part of our everyday life. And there is an issue every day. All right, so let's look at another source. And so this one is sort of a different question. So the first one that we looked at was a source that says, like, remember, if you ruin the world, nobody's going to come bail you out. Nobody's going to fix this world. So this is it. This is all you get, and you better treat it well. So this midrash, which is, so again, about 2,000 years old, is sort of back in some ways to the question of rule over it or tend it, and sort of the balance. And so this is actually setting up, again, an imaginary conversation, and I'm going to tell you who the players are in a minute, but they are really symbolic of somebody from ancient Rome versus one of our great rabbis who are in this imaginary dialogue together about the natural world versus what human beings do with those resources. And so let's just read it, and then I'm going to try to unpack it a little bit. So Turnus Rufus was probably actually really existed, and he was a Roman official. And if you know anything about Jewish history, after Rome conquered the land of Israel in 70 of the Common Era, they destroyed the temple. They had laws against studying Torah and practicing Judaism. Part of that was because the Jews kept rebelling against Roman rule. And so the idea was, if we can turn them into good Roman citizens and show them, how much better our culture is, they'll stop driving us crazy and they'll stop being Jews. And so we read about the great rabbis, and Rabbi Akiva is one of them, who stood up and studied Torah. We read about he was tortured to death for this, as were other great rabbis of his generation. But we also know that Rabbi Akiva supported the Bar Kokhba revolt against Rome. So whether he was actually tortured to death for teaching Torah or tortured to death for helping to support a revolt against Rome, possibly the latter. But we have many stories about Rabbi Akiva, and we have many stories in our tradition. Turnus Rufus was his jailer, And we have many stories in the tradition about dialogues between the two of them. Again, maybe true, maybe not true. This is the thing about Jewish texts. I think we always need to ask is not whether they are historically true. Are they morally true? Are they true that they come to teach us something about the world? So Turnus Rufus, the wicked, asked Rabbi Akiva, which are more beautiful, the works of God or of flesh and blood? Now let's just stop there. Hopefully you haven't read beyond that. That is actually a fascinating question, right? Like anybody that loves nature, anybody that loves, as we do in our family, going to national parks or going to the ocean, you look at the beauty of the world, and of course you are awestruck about the beauty and power of nature that no human being could create. That seems like such an obvious question, right? It would be such an obvious question that the world that God created is obviously so much better than the world that a human being can create. But it's sort of a straw man, right? It's sort of a straw man because actually we're going to see how Rabbi Akiva explains it, but most of us really like a lot of things that were created by human beings. Like the heat that's coming in my house right now, my comfortable chair that I'm sitting on, the computer, the home that I live in. We like human creation. And so it's an interesting juxtaposition then, this question between, the works of God and the works of human being, and, which is greater. So Rabbi Akiva says, okay, sorry, first, Akiva says, those of flesh and blood are more beautiful, which again, at first blush, seems like crazy. How could you say that like the house that I create is more beautiful, than the Rocky Mountains? And so Turnus Rufus, the wicked, responded, behold the heavens and earth. Can you make something like them? Rabbi Akiva responded, do not speak with me about something which is beyond humans, for they do not control them, but regarding things that are found amongst people. So he's saying this is a stupid question. Like, of course, like if we're going to talk about the mountains and the ocean, like those are beyond human beings. So if you're going to say that, like, then there's no conversation to be had. And so the Roman, Turnus Rufus, wants to know, why do you circumcise? Right? This is the question. Why do you circumcise? And Akiva responds, I knew you would ask this. Hence, I said in advance that the works of flesh and blood are more beautiful than those of God. He brought him ears and loaves, ears of corn, not human ears, and said to him, these are the works of God, and these are the works of flesh and blood. Are these not more beautiful? They brought him bundles of flax and garments from Beit Sha'an and said, these are the works of God. These are the works of flesh and blood. Are these not more beautiful? So let's just stop here for a minute. So in this theological debate, the question is which is more beautiful, the works that God made or the works that human beings made? Rabbi Frankel used to say the most meaningful Jewish blessing is the blessing that we say over bread, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, right? We bless God for bringing forth bread from the earth. Rabbi Frankel would say, but God doesn't bring forth bread from the earth. God brings forth wheat or flax or ears of corn, and it's human beings that turn them into bread, turn them into clothing, turn them into something that's sustainable, that's usable, that we use to protect ourselves. And so Akiva would say that shows that the works of human beings are great. It's greater. Now, Rabbi Frankel would say it shows that there's a partnership, right? There's a partnership. But he's not going to drop the question of circumcision. So he said, if God wanted circumcision, why doesn't the child leave its mother's womb already circumcised? Right? If God didn't want a foreskin, why didn't God create a baby without a foreskin? And then Rabbi Akiva responds, why does the umbilical cord come out attached to the baby? Does not his mother cut his umbilical cord? Why does the child not leave the womb already circumcised? Because God gave Israel the commandments to purify them. And then he quotes from King David. So the argument is, okay, we circumcise. A baby isn't born circumcised, but you too, every human being, if God wanted a baby, why is a baby born connected to the umbilical cord? Why isn't the umbilical cord cut, and then the baby's born without it? So even in every birth, a human being has to do something to change the situation. But it's a moral teaching. And, frankly, this question, again, is even, we're not facing it so much in the Midwest, but I can tell you that my colleagues in Los Angeles and especially in San Francisco are facing this question quite a bit, which is, why circumcise? Why would you do that? Why would you do that to a baby? Why would you do that? As I said, I've only had to deal with that question a couple times in my rabbinate. I would have thought more by now, actually, knowing what's going on in other places in the country. It's one of the great benefits of being in Chicago. But according to this text, why do we circumcise a baby boy in our tradition? Julie? Wait, hold on. You got to unmute. Julie, you're muted.
Wow, that took forever. Because the line said God told us to purify, right? The commandment to purify. So God tells us it. I mean, nobody wants to have their kids circumcised. It's awful for the moms. I mean, most of us have to go through that. It's very upsetting, and you wonder whether there's a better way of doing it, blah, blah, blah. So, but if you're gonna follow, I guess that's one of the rules we all follow, even if some of us are not so good about other rules.
Right.
We still seem, at least in the Midwest, to be doing circumcisions.
Right. No, it's really interesting in that way, I have to say, because it's not a given everywhere in the country. So there's this idea of that a human being, even if they're born a certain way, has to be purified, right? And the other reason that's given, though he doesn't give this as an example, is it is a sign of the covenant, right? It's a sign of the covenant between God and the Jewish people. And that's what it is, right? Why do we do it? Because God wants us to do it. Vera.
It always, I have this question. Did I miss something, or women have a different way of being, having covenant with God? What is it?
In the Jewish tradition, the covenant goes through the male. So there is there's no physical act that brings a woman into the covenant of Israel. Today, I would say, when we do a baby naming for a girl, which was not part of our tradition until really maybe 30, 40 years ago at the most, that there are ceremonies now that bring a girl symbolically into the covenant of Israel. I will tell you, because I was, still part of this, not the first feminist wave of Judaism, but the second feminist wave of Judaism. There was a question. Should we, if we're going to do this ceremony to welcome a baby girl, should we do like a prick of blood, like in the baby's foot or something like that, to symbolize that the covenant, because part of the covenant of a Brit Milah is the drawing of a drop of blood. Should we require this of girls as well to make it egalitarian? It didn't catch on for probably incredibly obvious reasons. It did not catch on, which I think is, was probably the right move, right? The right move. But the physical manifestation of the covenant not only goes through the male, but specifically the genitalia, which is the specific organ, when we say Lador Vador, of bringing in the next generation, through the very genitalia that ensures, at least, on one side, that it happens. Judy, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, it also is something for man to do to connect with God. I mean, we're always told it's about our actions, you know, we think about even, you know, the Dead Sea, not the Dead Sea, the Sea of Reeds, when the Israelites are leaving Egypt, that someone has to walk into the water before God will take, you know, the sea and part it. And we see throughout that man has to take some sort of action to fulfill, I don't know, fulfill the commitment with God. And so the circumcision would be the first thing that a man is doing to continue the covenant.
So it's a partnership, right? God gives us, I mean, this is a dramatic example, right? It's a dramatic example of men are not born in boys exactly the way God would want them. Human beings have to do this serious act in order to bring a boy into the covenant. So if we get off circumcision, which is a dramatic example, though I will say, you know, I actually was at a Brit Milah last week. It was the first one that I had attended since COVID started in person. The first one I attended in person since COVID started. There have been some. Usually it was the mohel, the parents, and a Zoom. I mean, really at the height of COVID, sometimes the grandparents weren't even able to be in the room for obvious reasons. The mother had just come from the hospital, who knew what she might have been exposed to, and to expose the grandparents. So it had become a very private ceremony. This was really just immediate family and me. I have to say, it was really emotional for me. I mean, I watched this girl grow up and made her bat mitzvah and officiated her wedding and named her first child, and now was there to name this baby boy. But I really thought a lot about, first of all, I had said this on the high holidays, who the heck goes through a pandemic with a toddler at home and says, I'd like to have another baby. That sounds like a great idea. Let's get pregnant and bring another child into our house while we're working remotely with a toddler. So there's something really, you know, unbelievable about the human spirit in that. But I never take actually like a Brit Milah for granted anymore, if I ever did, because this idea that it's not an easy thing for parents to sit through, though I like Rabbi Turkel Taub. He is a very fast mohel, and I love him. But this idea of what does it mean to bring a child into the covenant, right? That there is this partnership that we don't take for granted, that parents are going to want to do this. Sorry. But there's also, let's talk about the least, not quite as dramatic example of flax and wheat, right? God gives us these resources. They are ours to use. And sometimes human beings have the ability to improve on the world that God gave us. That God gives us these raw materials. I've never picked a stalk of wheat and tried to eat it. I think it'd be probably not tasty and hard to digest, right? That human beings in sort of this Jewish stance towards the environment, that in some cases, we actually as human beings have the ability to take these raw materials and to do something with them for the good of humanity. The screen's just flipped. Martha, did you have your hand up?
Yeah. Okay, my question refers to where these inquiries about circumcision or about ritual slaughtering of animals comes from. And in other words, why aren't these people who are screaming about circumcision looking at genital mutilation in Africa? So again, I'm always sensitive to the question of, well, why are they looking at the Jewish issues again? And I don't think that it's entirely a question of study.
Look, this is a hard moral issue, right? We know that there are religious groups that practice clitorectomies, right? And the question is should that be legal in the United States? Is it so heinous that it should absolutely be illegal? Which I think it should. And then the question is, well, what if people think circumcision is heinous? Like, where's the line, right? Where's the moral line between people to have the freedom of religion, to practice it the way that they have always practiced it? And where do you say no? And the same, goes for ritual slaughter of animals. Like, we have a way of doing it, and there are certain countries in Europe that are constantly trying to ban it. So, where is that line between freedom of religion and people feeling like, and sometimes I think it is anti-Semitic, and sometimes, it may be a more gray area. Julie?
Well, there's nothing in the Quran that tells you have to practice that sort of female genital mutilation. That's a totally tribal and cultural thing. And there are lots of Muslim jurists who want nothing to do with it. So I think, I think we should outlaw it because it absolutely has nothing to do with somebody's religious tenets. Just like there's really no religion that says you can't get the COVID vaccine.
Right.
There's no, I defy any one theologian to find scripture that explains that. But I am surprised that this conversation between this Roman and the rabbi takes its turn and becomes, I don't know if you would call it a proof text for man's creations versus God's creation. I mean, are there any others? Because it's not that satisfying a text. I mean, the Romans and Greeks were obsessed with the notion that Jews were circumcising. In fact, during the Hellenistic period, some Jewish men even had their, I don't know how they do it, don't ask me, but had their circumcision reversed. And there were people who specialized in the surgery. So I think the more interesting question is, why doesn't God let us mix flax and wheat, or you know what I'm saying? Kilaim, is that the right term?
Clay.
There's no hybridity. What? So you're allowed to keep everything the way God created it. You can circumcise, but you can't mix, you can't blend animals.
Certain things, right? Certain things are, the Torah tells us, like, you can't mix like cotton and flax, like certain
or
things,
a horse
wool and flax, right? There's certain
and a
things,
burro.
and that's one of these unbelievable mysteries of, like, who knows, because God said, right? But I think what you said was actually really important. This debate between the Hellenistic world and the Jewish world over circumcision was a very ancient, was an ancient debate, and Jews that wanted to blend in either didn't circumcise their children or tried to reverse their circumcision. And it's a deep question, right, about Jewish identity. It's one of the things that made Jewish men very unsafe. Like, we can say, oh, the covenant goes through the men and blah, 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 but it's also one of the things that made Jewish men very unsafe in times of terrible discrimination against the Jewish community. I mean, there are stories like in the Warsaw Ghetto of women being smugglers because it was easier for them to pass, right? That a Jewish man, and today in the United States, where the vast majority of men are circumcised, this is not really so relevant here, but it is still relevant in Europe and other places where circumcision is not prevalent. So let's do one more text back to the environment. The thing about Hartman that's interesting is there are other environmental sources, why they chose this one versus that one, but they want to show that sort of that in our attitude towards the environment, it is considered a partnership, right? It's not just black or white. The idea isn't like just leave the natural world the way it is, live in a tent, draw water from the stream, never build a factory, stop driving your car. The idea is that human beings can bring creation into the world that's good and positive, and yet can also destroy it. And so it's all this like great balance. So let me bring you another text. This is, again, in the world of Jewish environmental ethics. This is a pretty famous one, and this is from the Torah. When in your war against the city, you have to besiege it a long time in order to capture it. You must not destroy its trees, wielding the axe against them. You may eat of them, but you must not cut them down. Are the trees of the field human to withdraw before you into the besieged city? Only trees that you know do not yield food may be destroyed. You may cut them down for constructing siege works against the city that is waging war on you until it has been reduced. So let's go back and unpack this. Torah recognizes that there's war, right? People lived in walled cities. That used to be the way you protected yourself against outside forces. So how do you get into the walled city? You built siege works. So if you are, again, God knows that anybody ever followed this utopian ideal, but if you are besieging a city, you can't cut down trees to build your siege siege works against them. You can eat, right? If you're besieging a city and you're in an apple orchard, you can pick the apples and eat them, but you can't cut down the trees. Our trees of the field, you meant to withdraw before you enter the besieged city. But what if you're in the city, right? What if people are coming against you? Can you cut down trees to build like a bigger fortress to protect yourself? And the answer is yes, as long as they're not food-bearing trees. So if you're attacking, no trees. If you are defending, you can cut down trees, but not fruit trees. You can't destroy fruit trees. Now, again, this actually, believe it or not, so again, right, you can't destroy food. Now, this actually, there are other Jewish sources that talk about you are not allowed to destroy or waste food. Like all those things where your parents used to tell you that you can't waste food is actually a Jew. Now, you couldn't package it up and send it to Africa or starving children, but actually this idea of not wasting food, not wasting, it's called Bal Tashchit in our tradition. And it is a mitzvah not to waste. And so it plays itself out in various ways. So anybody that's ever heard me teach about the environment has heard me teach this story. This used to drive me insane. My kids went to Mariah's amazing daycare when they were little. It is an amazing program. And we were very grateful that our kids, as a working parent, were in such good care. But every Monday morning, this was the fashion. I don't think anybody's doing this anymore, but every Monday morning, I would walk into the lobby of Mariah. And there had been a big bar mitzvah over Shabbat. And so the family must have been responsible for buying the beautiful floral piece that sat in the lobby. And for quite a while, the style was that if you had red flowers, that the big vase was filled with water with apples, right? Which was quite dramatic. The beautiful apples, the red flowers, the lemons, the whatever, the yellow flowers or whatever it was, so that the whole thing was filled with color. Only you were destroying food, which was a violation of Jewish law. So I would go into the executive director's office every few weeks and be like, I don't know why you're permitting this. This is destroying food. It happened one time at a big Schechter gala. Went to the rabbi, like, I don't understand why you're doing this. This is a direct violation of Jewish law. And eventually it went out of style, which was a good thing, but nobody was allowed to do it at Am Yisrael. You're not allowed to destroy food. You're not allowed to destroy, to waste clothing, to waste things. You're allowed to use these things, but you're not allowed to wantonly waste things. It's actually one of the reasons why you're actually supposed to be buried in shroud and not in clothing. Because the idea is you donate the clothing for somebody to use. Like, so this idea of, you just don't, even in the case of war. So I'll tell you something that, again, like some of these things are actually, you think, well, okay, so they're ancient things, they're not so topical, but guess what? There have been, Arab farmers who have olive groves, and sometimes settlers go in just to be nasty and cut down the olive trees. Sometimes there's a claim by the Israeli army that Arab farmers hide behind these olive trees and maybe throw stones or do things that they shouldn't be doing. And so they feel then justified to go in and, and cut down these trees. It is a direct violation of Jewish law, right? To cut down trees, to not let these farmers harvest their crops. There are Jewish organizations that actually go in to help Arab farmers harvest their fields to keep them safe from the Jewish settlers, many of whom would say that they're religious, who are violating one of the primary foundational Jewish texts about not destroying and wasting food. Marcia, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, it's like salting the fields.
Right.
If olive trees take forever to mature to bear fruit. And it's terrible to do that.
Right.
And it sounds like how big is an olive tree after all? Really, come on. It just sounds like a bad justification to me, and I'm peeved. And I'm glad that there's somebody on their side helping them to do that, to save the harvest.
Right. I mean, it's, you'd think, like, does this have any bearing in today in Jewish law? And it's like, yes, it does. Right. Jody, we got on.
So what is the, I know in California, they're having a terrible problem with water, and they're letting their crops go fallow because there's not enough water and it's too expensive water. So that, I would imagine, that's sort of kosher because the water comes from the heavens, and you shouldn't be forced to make the trees grow if they don't grow on natural water.
We can't waste water. So the fascinating thing, there is a book called, I think it's called Let There Be Water, about Israel becoming water independent, which now they've done through the ability to desalinate, and it's affordable. But it is like almost like a mystery, like how, first somebody discovered drip irrigation, and then how did they do this? And then the technology that they put in, so not a drop of water is leaked in somebody's house before the monitor goes off to know that you have a leak before, like, blah, blah. And the fascinating technology that Israel has created around sustainable water, which they are sharing in other places of the world, and have a lot actually to teach some of these places that are, especially with climate change, going to have less and less water. But, I was at a, there's a real ethical question about, should we, let's say, eat almonds or drink almond milk, knowing the tremendous amount of water that it takes to produce almonds, and most of them are grown in California where they don't have water. But what happens to the almond farmers? There's this constant, do you say, well, sorry, almond farmers, go, coal miners, like, go get retrained and find something else that you can grow on your land, because we're not going to buy this anymore. It's a difficult question. I don't know any almond farmers, so I can say, you know what, stop drinking almond milk. It's horrible for the environment. But if my brother was an almond farmer, I might feel a little bit more sympathetic about, for him. And that is part of this balance that we all have to sort of live with. Harold.
Isn't the point that you just made, doesn't that bring us back to when you said that the environmental issues are political issues? Aren't they also ethical issues? So we learned earlier about the specific relationship of human beings to God, different than others, different than the ocean. So we also learned, though, today that we ethically have to protect the environment. But when you protect the environment, sometimes you might hurt some people who have a special relationship, even if they're not Jewish, we learned, to God, or even if they are Jewish. So it's an ethical question, isn't it? What can you, if you do something that's going to cost a bunch of jobs, can you say that's life, or do you have to worry about those jobs and figure out how to mitigate that?
So that's why I vote Democrat, right? Because I feel like you have to worry about the environment. You have to believe in science, and you have to think about how are you going to retrain these poor people, because I'm sorry, you can't work in the coal mines anymore. So yeah, you don't just say to them, well, good luck to you, you're on your own, and hope for the best. That it's that all of these ethics sort of roll into how we think about the environment, how we think about caring for people who are could get harmed in when you make these decisions. I do want to say one more thing about science, which is she off? Is Deanna off? Oh, well. Mark and Deanna Jacobson, if you read what I sent to the congregation, I don't know that we've ever had a prouder moment at the congregation. 190 kids getting their first vaccine on Sunday at the synagogue made Am Yisrael look fantastic. And I had several of our congregants come up to me and say, there are places in this country where religious leaders are discouraging their people from getting vaccinated, and look what we're doing here. And I hadn't really thought about that so much. I really just thought about, that it was an amazing thing that we were doing both for us and open to the community. We had a lot of people that weren't members of Am Yisrael be able to participate. So I was very proud of that. But, when we talk about the environment and we talk about climate, by and large, Jews believe in science. And that's really, and I'm going to wrap up with this, what this first source said to us, not going to come and miraculously fix the world for you. There's not going to be a magic wand that's going to get waved, right? You got information, use the information to make the choices to know that once you use this up, or once you destroy it, or once this endangered species is dead, that's it. And that's the whole beauty of science in the Jewish tradition, is the belief that that is the ultimate partnership between God and human beings. That God gave us the ability to understand these things and to learn how, what to do about it. In the Jewish tradition, that is divine. So, all right. So that's that. Have a lovely week. Glad we all had internet today for us Comcast customers that weren't sure what was going to happen. And I will see you all next week.